Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 3 game from the Xtracon Open. Now, if you followed the round 2 video, you know that I won a relatively clean game with black in the London system, and I was now 2-0 and trying to keep that momentum going because you pretty much have to win some of your first few games to, play up and play those top opponents. So in this one, I was playing down for a 3rd round in a row, but the opponents are getting tougher. And in this one, I was playing another untitled player, but he was relatively close to 2,300. He was around 2,250, 2,260 or so. So definitely, the opponents are getting a little bit tougher, and I have to be even sharper. Now, my opponent in this one, his name was Schwarz from Germany. And that's also the cool thing about playing in these tournaments is you actually play people from all around the world in these international events. So pretty cool point there. But anyways, I was white and going to try and put some pressure on him, so let's get into it. So I opened with d4, and Frank played knight f6. And after c4, e6 was played. And then I went for knight c3, pretty much inviting a Nimzo Indian. I actually noticed that he had, essayed the Nimzo in the past, so I actually was decently prepared. And I actually hadn't played the Nimzo so much leading up to this point, so I thought it might be a surprise for him. So anyways, after knight c3, bishop b4 was played, and now we actually do find ourselves in a Nimzo, and this is one of the richest openings in chess. Really dynamic history. Been played by many champions of the past, and there are just so many lines that are playable. It's almost like the Ruy Lopez in that way, and then it has this really rich and dynamic history. There are many moves here for white. White can go a3 and, challenge the bishop right away and, get double pawns but get the bishop pair. f3 is a move. e3 is a move, the Rubinstein variation. Knight f3 is a move. g3 is a move. But the move I actually opted for was queen c2. And this was something I'd essayed in my previous tournament against Yaroslav Zarabuk in the New York International that was held at the Marshall Chess Club. So my last tournament right before this, so I think like 4 games ago, I believe. And that game was a long draw. You saw that the rook versus the rook versus rook and knight endgame I was able to hold. But even before that, I actually had a good position with white and wasn't defending. And I tend to like these structures because white essentially gets the bishop pair right away after a3, but doesn't compromise his pawn structure to do it. So white has the long-term trumps in the position. In the short term, black has a lead in development, and so white typically has to kind of catch up and not fall prey to any attacks against the king or slip up in that way. But white does have the long-term trumps, and that's why I think it's kind of an attractive line to play. After queen c2, black actually played c5, and this is known as the Berlin variation of the Nimzo, I believe, with c5. It's the classical variation, and within the classical, the sub-variation, I believe, is the Berlin. And the idea is to challenge white's pawn center right away and actually secure the bishop on b4. So typically, in most of the lines, if after castles or even after d5, white is going to go a3 and secure that bishop pair. So, for instance, if castles, a3, this was my game against Yaroslav Zarabuk, bishop takes c3, queen takes c3, b6. White does lack development but gets the bishop pair. In the line with c5 right away, white doesn't actually get the bishop pair because a3 is not a very good move here because the d4 pawn is under fire. So in this position, after bishop takes c3, if I insist on, keeping my pawn structure intact with queen takes c3, now c takes d4, queen takes d4, and knight c6 gives black a very satisfactory position because even though white has the bishop pair here, black actually has too significant a lead in development for this to matter. It can actually break with d5 very quickly as well, and this is just not a good position for white. So because of that, white actually has to deal with the c5 pawn and does so by capturing on c5. And here, typically the most popular move is actually castles, but in this position, Frank actually played bishop takes c5. And the idea there is that I think he's just insistent on taking right away, and he's gonna castle next move, but he's gonna preserve his bishop. But you can see in either line, whether you castle or you take on c5 right away, white actually didn't win the bishop pair. So it's actually one of the rare lines of the classical where this doesn't happen. But there are a few differences here that make this position also quite playable for white. So one of the things that's quite attractive in this line is now the d-pawn is kind of a backward pawn in a lot of lines. So if white can quickly get the bishop out to f4, g5, and play rook d1, the d-pawn becomes a target on the half-open file. Now, you might say, well, can't that d-pawn get exchanged for the c-pawn? Well, if that happens, typically black is okay. But a lot of times it's hard to negotiate that right away because white gets pressure on the knight and the queen on the f6, on the h4 to d8 diagonal. And the rook is on d1 and sometimes pins the d-pawn to the c-pawn. Or excuse me, the d-pawn to the queen, but basically doesn't allow d takes c4. And so those factors actually give white a slight advantage. And also, black did waste a little bit of time here, essentially playing bishop b4, then taking on c5. And so white is actually not as behind in development as he usually is. So anyways, after bishop takes c5, I went for knight f3, just developing. And now black made a move I really am not a fan of with knight c6. This move I'm not a huge fan of because the knight, in my opinion, is actually not well placed here. Typically, it's a little bit better on d7. A lot of times in these structures, black winds up getting something closely resembling a hedgehog. And the hedgehog is a structure that's quite common in Sicilians as well as some English type of setups and queen's pawn setups. And typically in the hedgehog, the dark square bishop wants to eventually get to e7, the pawn wants to get to d6, and this knight that's on c6 now typically wants to be on d7. And part of the reason for that is the knight on d7 can actually go to e5 or c5 and actually influence the e4 square if it actually is on c5. So imagine this knight on d7 on c5, it actually eyes the e4 square. And also, it's not in the way of the bishop, the light squared bishop, that typically wants to get to the long diagonal and influence things in the center from b7. With c6 here, the knight on c6, the bishop is actually blocked and not exerting as much influence. So it's for those reasons knight c6 I think is a little bit questionable. The other thing, by the way, is that he's actually delaying castling. And again, I've said this before, I'm going to say it again. Typically, when castling is an option that's available in a position, it's usually the best move. So there's no reason to kind of wait on it most of the time. And so castling here would be way more sensible in my opinion. But anyways, knight c6 was played. And now one thing that knight c6 does introduce that kind of bothered me was actually knight b4. And so I thought it made sense to play a3 here and provide some prophylaxis against this b4 idea, or knight b4, sometimes harassing my queen. It turns out this wasn't necessary. Instead, I could have just continued developing with bishop g5 or bishop f4 and, just got a satisfactory position. But a3 is playable, and I haven't spoiled anything here. But now after a3, Frank actually made a terrible, terrible mistake with the move a5. And this move, unfortunately, does irreparable damage to white's queen side. If you just look at the move a5 and you ask yourself which squares are weakened, and right off the bat, you can see that b5 is extremely sensitive now because it can never have coverage from a black pawn again. And that is a huge problem because this d-pawn is already backwards. So if a knight is ever able to get to b5 and exert, that type of pressure on d6, this is a huge problem. And just this weakness is just really significant. The other thing is that it also, takes time away from actually castling. So again, we talk about castling being important. It should have been exercised here. And so that a5 is just a little bit slow and positionally very, very bad. Instead, if black castles, things are okay. Even d5 is playable here. Trying to get the position, steer it more towards queen's gambit lines as opposed to Nimzo lines. And the argument here would be that maybe my a3 move was not the most prudent because black is already pushing forward in the middle of the board. So d5 and castles were more playable than a3, but excuse me, than a5. And after a5, I was already thinking, man, like this b5 square is going to be something I take advantage of. So now, anyways, I went bishop f4, putting my bishop on this diagonal. Now, you can also put the bishop on g5. This is also very playable. But the reason that f4 appealed to me is because of the sensitivity of the b5 square. And just thinking about my knight landing on that square later in the game, I thought it'd be cool for my bishop to exert pressure on this diagonal. So after bishop f4, black finally castled. And now I played e3 because I kind of have to hustle to develop my king side and get my king castled. But you could see that the positional trumps in the position for me are huge. I have good coverage of the center with my pieces. My pawn e3 is actually really nice because it blunts the bishop on c5, which is pretty ineffectual on this diagonal now. And the half-open d-file will be a huge asset for my rook in the future. So really, really nice for me. And I think the other thing that's kind of important is if black lashes out with d5, he didn't do so, but if he did, I have two really attractive options. I can actually pin the d-pawn right away, or I can even consider taking on d5, because in positions after d5, if I capture, black can't really capture with the knight cleanly because the bishop is actually hanging on c5, and after rook d1, the queen is under fire, and this position is very tough for for black to deal with pretty much. So because of that, in many positions you actually have to play e takes d5, and at the very least I get a chance to play against an isolated pawn, which gives me a long-term positional trump. And as long as this pawn doesn't get pushed to d4, I should have a massive edge. So yeah, I think already here black is kind of in the white is in the driver's seat, and black is really struggling to equalize. Black now went rook e8. I can't completely explain that move, but I guess it makes some sense in conjunction with his next move, but it's a little bit slow. I think instead he would have been better served trying to play b6 and bishop b7 and just developing. Again, the structural defects on the queen side aren't things that he can necessarily fix, but he can try to develop his pieces and connect his rooks, and that at least contributes to that idea. Instead, after rook e8, now I played the move rook d1, and now I've trained my eyes firmly on d5, so you can't break anymore. And also d6 is really sensitive, and the position is already critical because of these weaknesses that are created. So it's amazing that just by developing and just this one little move a5 just did so much harm to his position. After rook d1, black went e5, challenging my bishop on f4 on this diagonal, and kind of, saying you're not going to totally dominate on the d-file squares, d6 and d5 right away. But the issue here is that you create more weaknesses. So if we just look at the pawn, the weaknesses that are created by this pawn push, you always just have to look at the adjacent squares. And the adjacent squares to e5 are d5 and f5. And those are serious, serious holes now that really can't be well covered by pawns. Again, d5 can never be covered by a pawn again because the c pawn is gone and the e5 pawn is too far advanced. And f5 can now only be covered by g6. And then g6 would weaken more squares. So you could just see here, you weaken squares, you give new targets, and it's better not to do that. Normally when you already have weakened enough, when you've already weakened squares, typically if you weaken more, it just does more harm than good, and it's better to just try to make moves that don't weaken more squares. And so that's why e5 shouldn't have been played. Again, probably something like b6 and bishop b7 would be better, but again, maybe if you don't play e5, what's the point of rook e8? Maybe in some lines a rook e8 might facilitate bishop f8 going back, but again here with the rook on e8 now, knight b5 is actually more potent because of the fork. So I can understand the idea e5 in conjunction with rook e8, it just doesn't make a lot of sense objectively. So anyways, after e5, I went bishop g5, and now I have a nice new diagonal to play with, pressuring the knight and this queen on d8. And you can see now that the d5 square is is sensitive, I can even hop into there and add more pressure to this pin. So white is doing really, really well. And you can also see here another example of how the knight is misplaced on c6. Note that, both my pawns are kind of controlling the squares in the middle of the board. And the knight would be much better on d7, where it would actually support the knight on f6 and allow the queen to get out of the pin without, doubling his pawns. So anyways, after bishop g5, h6 was played. And this is actually another mistake. Really because it just creates another potential target, honestly, and it weakens more squares. Now, it does make sense to try and relieve the pin, but again, now h6 weakens the light squares, particularly g6, and the light squares are already very sensitive, so it's a little bit of a poor choice. The other thing is it actually invites bishop takes f6, which is actually quite a decent move. I actually should have played bishop f6. I didn't do it because I thought that there's no reason for me to give up the bishop pair, and I thought keeping the tension on and the pin would be more effective. But actually, after bishop takes f6 and queen takes f6 and bishop e2, white just has a massive, massive advantage here based upon these weak squares d5 and e4. And the point is that after a move like d6, now white goes knight d2, and these knights are just unassailable on the e4 and d5 squares. I'm going to park a knight, the d2 knight on e4. I'm going to castle. I'm going to have pressure against the d6 pawn and the c5 bishop. And again, this knight on c6 is completely misplaced. So that's why this position is actually +1 for white already. Instead, a better move, actually, really the only move the computer thinks gives black a decent fighting chance, is actually the amazing knight d4. And the point is with knight d4 that the piece is actually not, it's kind of immune. It's very, it's not ideal to capture because now the rook is on e8. There's actually massive pressure against my king on e1 since it hasn't castled yet. And so this actually kind of justifies that position of the knight on c6 at least. Now, I can just play queen b1 and I still retain an advantage because after knight takes f3, g takes f3, even though my pawn structure appears a little bit mangled, these double pawns actually do a great job of controlling central squares, and I still have this knight that does a great job of controlling d5 and e4, so black does not have a pawn break to speak of in the position. And actually, the open g file now gives my rook on g1 attacking prospects on the black king. So this position is actually still quite a bit better for white. But knight d4 was the best try. And, it is quite complicated. Just to show you if I played e takes d4, this is not a good move, and I wouldn't have done it. But if e takes d4 check, knight e2, black has the very strong queen b6. And here there are all types of ideas. d5 is an idea, and then just developing the bishop. d3 is sometimes an idea with bishop takes f2 check. Black just has way too much activity here to even entertain gobbling the piece. But okay, and the funny thing about knight d4 also is that this idea with rook e8 and knight d4 is actually a line, is very similar to a line in the Queen's Gambit Declined that Caruana has been essaying quite a bit at the highest level. There's this weird repetition with knight d4 and the queen has to move and then knight c6 back or something like that. You definitely can take a look at some of Caruana's Queen's Gambit Decline games and see this rook e8 and knight d4 maneuver. And actually, just to give you a little bit more precision, Hikaru Nakamura has actually played this rook e8, knight d4 stuff in the Queen's Gambit a ton. So actually, he would be someone that would be even better example to look at some of the repetitions that exist in positions similar to this. But here it doesn't quite work because I can just ignore it and keep developing. So anyways, after h6, I went bishop h4. And again here, it turns out that the best move is knight d4, trying to get some counterplay in the middle. And I have to go queen b1 again to try and play for something. And black actually, can try and fight here with d5 and, play very actively and aggressively. There's some crazy lines here, like if I play knight takes d5, g5 is a move. And then after knight takes g5, h takes, bishop e7. Black is actually holding on in this position. So this is just a way to play. Just want to show you a funny line. If I took on d4 after e takes d4, and then, I don't know, let's say bishop takes f6, bishop b4 would be mate because the rook and the bishop are both checking the king on e1, and there's no way to go. So this would be one of these funny double discovery mates that, happens like once in a lifetime. Again, not a forced line at all. I just thought it's kind of funny to show that. Yeah, okay, after d5, I can play bishop takes f6. And again, this seems to be a decent positional way to play a lot of times, is you take on f6, give up the bishop pair, and then secure the knight on this monster outpost on d5. And even though I don't get to castle in this type of line, white is still better because of this knight on d5, really good control of the light squares, and this bishop is kind of blunted on e3. So white still holds an edge here. Although this is, again, is much better than what happened in the game, all things considered. So anyways, after bishop h4, Black did not go for the spectacular knight d4 and instead went bishop e7, relieving himself of this pin. And I finally just decided to keep developing because, again, the damage has been done to Black's position. These light squares are going to be real targets for me. The D pawn is backward, the B pawn is backward, and I just got to finish developing and then take advantage. So I went bishop e2 just to develop. And after b6, a move that he should have done a while ago without e5, I castled. And the position is actually already winning. It's hard to imagine. The material's equal. It doesn't seem so bad, but the weaknesses of these squares are just too much to overcome. And I think it's actually quite instructive how I take advantage of this. Because now Black played bishop b7, and now I systematically take advantage of all these weaknesses. I start with the move knight b5. And the idea with this one is actually just to drop a knight on d6 and secure the bishop pair, because from d6 I'm attacking the rook on e8 and the bishop on b7, and something's got to give. And actually there are two threats. I can play knight d6 right away and force him to trade, but I can also even entertain bishop takes f6. And after bishop takes f6, g takes f6 would have to be played if he doesn't want to lose in exchange to knight d6. So there's already massive, massive threats in this position based upon this knight d6 idea. Black now went rook f8 back to dodge this knight d6 threat, but you can see here that that move is kind of unfortunate because he played rook e8 just 5 or 6 moves ago, and now he's moving it back, and it's just an undoing of a plan that didn't make sense, and this, again, just hurts him. And I decided, you know what, I don't have to drop this knight on d6 right away. Why don't I play the move bishop g3 and attack something else? And now that the rook has left the e-file, I thought this pawn is under real fire. And, essentially, there isn't a great way to defend it, because if you play d6, I can take it anyway based upon the pin of the rook on the queen. So huge problem here. Just loses a pawn. And after knight takes e5, bishop takes e5, a second pawn will drop as well because I have too many attackers on d6. So after bishop g3, Black actually went queen b8 to defend this pawn. And again, now he's actually walked into a pin on e5 and through e5. The e-pawn can't move. The bishop is now lined up against the queen on b8. Really rough. And so now I actually decide to just add more pressure to the position with, I think, the beautiful looking knight h4. And now this knight all of a sudden gets to take advantage of this other juicy square, the f5 square. So you can see my knight is already, one knight's on b5 taking advantage of that weakness. d5 is, clamped down on. And now the knight on h4 is going to come to f5 with decisive effect. And the issue is here that the bishop would be under fire. There might even be some attacking chances on the king side. If a move like g6 is played, I can actually just sack, and this position would be completely winning. I'd have 3 pawns for the piece and a massive attack well, 4 pawns for the piece if you consider rook takes d7, and this position would just be lost. Too many weaknesses here, too many threats here, too much control. So this would kind of be out of the question. And yeah, the knight's just coming to f5 with decisive effect. Black now went d6 to try and protect this pawn on e5 like that, and at least the queen is now no longer has to be a defender on that diagonal. But now the knight comes into f5, and now I'm threatening e7, taking on e7. I'm threatening the d6 pawn, and look at just the weaknesses of these squares on the 5th rank have come to really hurt Black. After knight f5, Black went rook d8. You can see now this rook went to e8, then back to f8, now to d8 in the span of the past 10 or so moves. So not optimal at all. But he does hold the d6 pawn for the moment. And I thought, you know what, I could cash in and, get this bishop on e7, but I also can add pressure to the position, and that's why I decided to play bishop h4. And the idea here is that, you know what, if the bishop moves away from e7, if like bishop f8, I can actually go knight takes h6 and win a pawn, a very important pawn, and just win the game, because now my bishop's on f6. I can come into f5 and give some decisive checks. So this wouldn't be playable at all. And so the bishop is actually kind of frozen on e7. And again, the knight on f5 is unassailable because h6 is hanging. And I'm also threatening now knight takes e7 and bishop takes f6, doubling the g-pawns, and giving another weakness. So just a ton of problems. Black now went bishop c8 to challenge this knight on f5. And here I decided to just take on f6 finally, which was something I could have done a long time ago to secure the light squares. But here it's just a decisive move, because if you play g takes f6, I can actually take the pawn on h6. And if you play bishop takes f6, I can take the pawn on d6. So just totally losing. After bishop takes f6, Frank played bishop takes f5, intermediate move, trying to get rid of this pesky knight on f5 and keep his material level. But the issue here is that after queen takes f5 and bishop takes f6, I have masterful control of the light squares, and that just proves to be a problem even in this simplified position. So white actually has a way to get a forced win here, and the move is actually just bishop f3. And the issue here is that now these light squares are so weak, and the knight and the rook are actually skewered. So it's impossible to save the position here, and I'm actually going to win in exchange, because after the move knight e7, which was played, now I actually just have queen e4. And all of a sudden the rook here doesn't have the a7 square, and if you go to a6, I actually have queen b7 still targeting that a6 rook, and exchanges don't help. So rook a7 was played, but just to show you, if rook a6, queen b7 still gets at that rook, and trading the queens does not save the rook here. And again, I still have this pressure on the d file. I'm going to pick up an exchange. Just totally decisive. After queen e4, Black played rook a7. Note that one other way you could try is to play d5 to block this diagonal. But after c takes d5, I'm going to follow up with d6 next and secure the exchange again. So you could just see the control of the light squares here is just incredible. So anyways, after rook a7, I took the exchange. And after queen takes a7, I thought that maybe my opponent would resign, but he thought he might have a little bit of play in this position, and I tried to make sure that wasn't the case. So I just tried to trade pieces now and extinguish any thought he had of maybe holding this position. And so I started with the move rook d2. And the simple idea here is now just to double rooks and, attack the d6 pawn mercilessly. Because the other issue here is this knight on e7 is actually dominated. It can't actually support any of the defense because these light squares are all under my control. And the bishop on f6 is now under lock and key behind its e5 pawn. So the issue is his minor pieces are also really clumsy. After rook d2, knight g6 was played, at least, I guess, trying to get this bishop to e7 to protect this pawn. But now I went for rook fd1, attacking the d6 pawn again. And after bishop e7, I went queen c6. And my idea here with queen c6 is not only am I levying more pressure against the d6 pawn, I'm also boxing out this queen. So if this queen wanted to get active and get some counterplay, now it has nearly no squares to actually move without actually trading with me, and I'm happy to trade pieces. The other thing that's nice about queen c6 is that it holds the rook so on d8, so it can't actually get to the c file or just get active. And this is just, again, hugely problematic. After queen c6, black actually went queen a6, but and this is a blunder, but there just aren't many moves in this position. I mean, I could try to just, trade the bishop for the knight and simplify that way, but I saw a nice little tactic here that works because the queen is undefended and went for the move c5. And amazingly here, either capture loses material. Obviously, if b takes c5, the queen is lost, and if d takes e5, the rook is lost. So he can't capture on c5, and this means that this c-pawn is now going to be a real runner. After e4, which hit my bishop, I just took this one, and now black went knight e5, at least activating the knight with tempo. But now I just played queen takes b6, and again, now I'm just a ton of pawns, the exchange. This is lost. Queen takes b6 was played. I played c takes b6, and black played knight c4, forking my rook on d2 and the pawn on b6. But I decided, you know what, I don't even need my exchange anymore, and went for b7 because now this pawn is a protected passer. And actually, after b7, my opponent resigned. And the reason for that is if you play knight takes d2, I could play rook takes d2 and then shift my rook over toward c8 and win the game. But I also can start with the funny-looking move rook c1 right away. And the point is that if you go knight takes e4, I go rook c8, and I just queen my pawn. Even though I'm 2 pieces down, the pawn is not being stopped. And the issue is the king on g8, prevents the rook from really supporting or stopping the b pawn. So for instance, after rook c1, if black tries to go rook b8 and get in front of the pawn before rook c8 check anyway basically picks up the rook and wins the game. So the pass pawn is just too much, and Frank acknowledged that, and the game was over. I thought this was a really clean game. I felt pretty good about the way I played this Nimzo. I got a positional edge. Of course, this move a5 helped me considerably because it gave me a lot of weaknesses, particularly the b5 square for my knights to jump into. And I liked in the middle game how I went knight b5 and knight f5 and just totally took control on the 5th rank based upon the pawn moves that he pushed. And I think it's very, very instructive from the standpoint of, whenever you push a pawn, you create weaknesses, and those weaknesses can hurt you down the road. So, yeah, I was 3-0 after this game. This game was actually the second game of the day because there's one day during the tournament where you play 2 games. It's always the second day of the tournament you play 2 games. And so the tournament is 10 rounds, but it's 9 days. And so getting 2 wins in the 2-round day was nice. And now he's on 3-0 and sure to play a really strong Grandmaster in round 4 because there were now only about 30 or so players that were undefeated. So anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.